Good evening. We're going to begin with Genesis chapter 18, and here we're going to talk about what is a set time, because there's a set time in heaven, and we call it the heavenly calendar. Also, we're going to talk about the sin of Sodom, and the sin of Sodom, and what happens when the righteous intercede. So, so we're going to begin here in Genesis chapter 18. And we continue here in verse 1. It says, and in verse 1 and 2, it says, and the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre. And he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground. Yet the Lord appeared to Abraham in the plains of Mamre. And this is the 6th time the Lord had appeared to Abraham. Now and here, but he appeared to him in a different form. And these were through men. It's men like angels. These are angels manifested in a human form. And this goes along with Hebrews 13 verses 2, and it says in Hebrews that sometimes we entertain angels not being aware and do not know it. And likewise, we need to entertain strangers. And in doing so, in giving strangers the best, and in doing so, we can entertain angels. So, and as our Lord Jesus Christ said someday, that in Matthew 25 verses 34, Matthew 25 verses 35, it says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. And I was a stranger, you took me in. So these men were angels that Abraham were entertaining here. And here also he bowed toward the ground. He said that he bowed toward the ground, and later we will see it in Genesis 19 verses 1. Lot, Abraham's nephew, did the same, and he came and bowed to the ground. And this was the custom in those days, in the biblical custom, when somebody arrives in the house or a visitor. One of the things, they will bow, and they will bow to the visitor. And this is the model of hospitality that was done in those days. As Peter, we are to model hospitality, as Peter 1 verses 4 to 9 says, the hospitality towards one another is without grudging. And here is an example of Abraham, the patriarch. He saw these men, these were angels manifested in human form, and he came and he bowed himself, but you don't know that they are angels right now, but he just showing good hospitality to them. And then in verse 3 it says, and said, my Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves from under the tree. And in Genesis 19 verses 2, Lot did this hospitality too, and he asked to wash his feet. And that's one another custom that is done, is when the visitors came, they will wash their feet, they will take care of the visitors. And you see this also in Joseph's day. Joseph did the same thing as well in Genesis 42 verses 24. And that was the form of washing the feet, and it was a custom in that day all the way to Jesus' day. Because if you recall, Jesus also washed the feet of his disciples, and we don't do that, not so much today, but this is a lesson of hospitality that is shown in here. And then in verse 5 it says, and I will fetch a morsel of bread and comfort ye your hearts. After that ye shall pass on, for therefore are ye come to your servant. And they said, so do as thou hast said. And Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah, and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the heath. And Abraham ran unto the herd, and fetched a calf, tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hastened to dress it. Verse 8, and he took butter and milk and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. Now, he asked to fetch a morsel of bread to these strangers that just came into his home, and he offered them food. He offered them, he bowed to the ground, washed their feet, offered to wash their feet, and now he presented them with this food. And he went in and told Sarah. Of course, Sarah prepared the food, and Abraham killed this calf, and then he set it before their feet, and they ate. So in verse 9, and here it says, and they said unto him, where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. Now, this presents God here. God shows himself, because he has now, Abraham has now recognized this is God. And we see now these 3 men, of course, manifested by, this is God manifested in men in 3 forms. These are angelic human forms, look like man, but they are angels. But here they ask about Sarah, and Abraham said that Sarah is in the tent. So here they mention that they will return according to the time of life. Now, one other thing, in Genesis 18 verses 14, it says, is anything too hard for the Lord? And then he repeats himself, at the time appointed, I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Listen to this verse. It says, the time appointed, I will return according to the time of life. God says, there's an appointed time here. God making sure and putting an emphasis on this appointed time, and highlighting that he will return at the appointed time. And keep in mind that there is a time God is just set apart, and God follows this time carefully. And then he says, in similar with Elisha and the Shunammite woman, if you read in 2 Kings 4 verses 16, which says that, and he said, about this season, according to the time of life, thou shalt embrace a son. So it says, about this season, according to the time of life, you shall have a son. And here it says, Sarah shall have a son. Again, God reiterated his promise that he gave to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17 verses 19. He says that in a set time, Sarah is to have a son. See, it says in a set time. The Lord is accurate. The Lord is precise in what he does. The Lord is always knowing that he has a set time in everything, following his pattern. Despite what the world is seeing like is doing, God is following his pattern. God has a heavenly calendar that he follows. And here he says at the set time, in Genesis 17:21, God says, God named the child. He named the child that this was going to happen. He says this child is going to be Isaac, and that it will be by Sarah. God was precise. He says Isaac is going to be born, and it's going to come by Sarah in a set time, of which God is spoken of him. It says there's a heavenly calendar. Again, there's a heavenly calendar scheduled, and there's also an earthly calendar that is scheduled. And everything, when the heavenly calendar meets the earthly calendar, that's when God always manifests what He's planned to do on this earth. You see, God has a set time for what He's going to do on earth and everything, and that's what happens here. And then in verse 11 it says, "And now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women." Now, physically, this was an impossible thing. Sarah is now old and she's no longer going to bear a child. She doesn't look like she's going to bear any child. She has passed the childbearing age. And the Bible said that Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90. Again, in Abraham in Genesis 17:17 talked about their age. Abraham laughed. He says, "Shall I, me who's been 99 years old, and Sarah almost 90?" And then it says that, can they have children? You know, is it impossible to have children at that age? You know, in addition to that, in Romans 4 verses 19, you know, which confirm more about Abraham's age. It says that Abraham was 100 years old when he finally had a child, and also Sarah's womb by now is dead. You know, there's no way Sarah can have a child at this time, and she has way past the childbearing age. Her womb here represents a tomb that is completely dead, and God waited for this time to happen, that completely things that look impossible on this earth will be possible. And that's what God says, you know, He's waited for this time for all these things to happen. And it says in verse 12, it says, "Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord also being old?" You know, before Abraham laughed, and same now with Sarah. You know, she laughed, and this is the laughter of doubt. Sarah did laugh for doubt because she did not, for one thing, know the promise. God didn't tell her the promise. He told it to Abraham. And God knows the thoughts of Sarah within herself. And also notice, God knows that everything about Sarah, you know, and we're going to see it here. But also notice the sign of humility from Sarah. She called Abraham my Lord. And she was a great submissive woman. And also, she has a great personality. She was not a pushover, but however, she was a great wife. And it says in 1 Peter 3, chapter 5 and 6, it says Sarah obeyed, calling Abraham Lord. And this woman is a model for Christian wife. She was a woman of humility and substance. And now she's old and wise and gracious woman. So you see, but here she has her own doubt here. She says, "Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?" In other words, how is this going to happen? You know, this is impossible. Can I enjoy sex anymore? This is something that she don't think that is going to be possible here. And here it says in verse 13, "And the Lord said unto Abram, Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child, which I am old?" It says, "Is there anything too hard for the Lord?" And then God repeats himself here as God says, "At the time appointed, I will return unto thee according to the time of life." See, at the time appointed, there's an appointed time in heaven. In everything concerning earth, there's an appointed time. God has put everything like I said, I mentioned before, there's a heavenly calendar. God has appointed everything. So God says, at the appointed time, I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. You see, first the Lord asked, why did Sarah laugh? And God said, is there anything too hard for the Lord? Is there anything too hard for God? God is El Shaddai. He's El Shaddai, and he's all sufficient in everything. God, nothing is impossible for God to do. And he says, at the time of life, again, he says, he alluded to the heavenly calendar, and God goes by this heavenly calendar, and he's always on time. God is always on time. And he says, at the appointed time, I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. And then in verse 15, and then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, Nay, thou didst laugh. You see, Sarah said, I did not laugh. But God knows her. She says, but you laugh. She said she was afraid. Says, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And God says, yes, you laughed. And God knows everything. He knows us. He knows human being. And he read her thoughts. He knows everything in her. About. God says, is there anything too hard for me? And in the set time, I will come, and you shall have child, in the appointed time, in the time of life, you will come. This is a woman that is past a childbearing age. She's 90 years old, but still, God says, you will have a child at the appointed time. And in verse 16, and the man rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. See, these men, they rose up and looked towards Sodom, because Sodom was in their sight. And these men were angelic beings in a human form. Okay? And this is God manifested in an angelic form here. Look like human beings, but these were angels. And God now is dealing with Sodom. He's going to deal with Sodom here. And sin always bothers God, you see, and God will judge every sin. God will judge every nation that has been sinning and do not follow his commandments. And God now sets his sight at Sodom. And he says here in verse 17, and he says, and the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. God says Abraham is going to be the father of all nations. God says, am I going to hide everything that I was supposed to do? Now God is going to destroy Sodom, because God has given Sodom chances. But now God says, I can't hide it, what I'm going to do from Abraham. And I need to tell him. And God tells those who are closest to him secret things. As it says in Psalm 25 verses 14, it says, the secret of the Lord is with them that fear him. The secret of the Lord is with them that fear him, and he will show them his covenant. In addition to that is Proverbs 3 verses 32. It says, but for the froward is abomination to the Lord, but his secret is with the righteous. Jesus in John 7:17 says, if any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak for myself. God shows his hand to those that are closest to him. God always shows his hand and his secret to those that are closest to him. And God says, Here it says, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? God says, am I going to hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? What are my secret things I'm going to do? And God is going to destroy Sodom, because Sodom is a sin city. It has been polluted. And here God is going to show what he's going to do to Sodom, to Abraham. It says in verse 18, it says, seeing that Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom, now God tells Abraham, says, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great. In other words, the sin of Sodom is great before God. And he says, because the cry in Sodom is great, and because their sin is grievous. See, this sin bothers God. Sin bothers God when a nation commits grave immorality. And God says Abraham is going to be a great nation, and he doesn't want to keep things from Abraham. And Abraham is called a friend of God. He's a friend of God, because God, reveals things to Abraham more than you and I even know. But here in Genesis, also Genesis 22 verse 18, God says that your seed will be blessed because you obey my voice. You see, and now God has had it with Sodom. Sodom and Gomorrah had many sins. They had many sins, not just homosexuality, although that was one thing that this nation, Sodom and Gomorrah, was very dominant. It was a dominant homosexuality in Sodom and Gomorrah. But God called also their other sins. They says their sin is grievous. The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah, this is great sins, and these were sexual immorality people. Homosexuality was one of them, but they were filled with other sins, according to Ezekiel 16 verses 49. And it says in chapter 18, Genesis chapter 18 verse 21, it says, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is common to me, and if not, I will know. God says, I will go and investigate. Again, these are just words, technical terms God uses to say, I'm gonna go and investigate what is going on in Sodom. And because of the crying of Sodom, God says, I'm gonna go and look at it. And here in verse 22, and the men turned their faces from thence and went towards Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord. Now these are men, God incarnated angels that went out. And Abraham here stood before the Lord. And he says in verse 23, and Abraham drew near. You see, he drew near. And we're going to talk about this interceding of Abraham. Abraham was also a great intercessor, because we are, an example God says for us, particularly in Hebrews 10:22, God says, let us draw near, with true hearts, in full assurance of faith. God says, we can draw near and petition to God in full assurance. God wants us to challenge him by intercession. We are to draw near to God. That's the character of God. God wants us to, despite God creating this world, God still wants us to partake in pleading for a nation. And here God is going to destroy this nation, but he wants us to plead for our nations also, because God is merciful. And Moses, if you read Moses in Numbers 16:22, Moses interceded for the congregation. He interceded for the congregation when Korah rebelled against Aaron and against Moses' leadership. God was wroth in anger, and he wanted to destroy the entire congregation. But Abraham stood before God and interceded, and then God spared the congregation, but then destroyed Korah, just the family of Korah. And this is what God is, because God's intention was to destroy the entire congregation first, because he had it with the children of Israel. But because of Moses interceding for the people, God withdrew his hand. So God will sometimes withdrew his hand if we can intercede and beg for a nation or intercede of people, and here God is, going to trying to destroy this nation here. And here Abraham asked the Lord, he says, will thou destroy the righteous with the wicked? God says, Abraham says, are you going to destroy the righteous? Because now he has Lot in his mind. He thought that Lot was a righteous man, and the people of Lot, the family of Lot, remember the family of Lot left Abraham and went down to Sodom. So now in Abraham's mind was the Lot's family were still righteous. Now he's saying, well, God, are you going to destroy the wicked with the righteous? And now he's going to have to, talk God out of it. It says in verse 24, it says, peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Will thou also destroy and not spare the place of the 50 righteous that are therein? Abraham said, Lord, what if there's 50 righteous people in Sodom? Would you destroy them? God says, if there's 50 righteous in Sodom, if there are 50 righteous, I will not destroy them. That's the character of God. He says, God is merciful. He says, if there are 50 righteous in Sodom, I will not destroy it. I will spare the nation because of the remnant. And God will always spare a nation because of the remnant. And then in verse 25, it says, that be far from thee to do this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Abraham said, God, shall you the judge of all the earth, shall you not do right? God is the judge. God is the judge. Eventually, all of us are going to stand before a judge, and that's God. We are going to stand before him, and he's the great judge, and he's going to judge everything, all the earth. He's going to judge all things rightly. And, God gave this city an ample amount of time to repent. He brought calamity after calamity. You see the wars of kings was part of the judgment. But these people continue in their sin, and no one here turned to God. So now God has had enough. Now he's going to judge this city. And it says in verse 26, it says, and the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, I will spare all the place for their sake. God said, if I find 50 people, 50 righteous people, 50, I will spare all of them for their sake. And look at how gracious God is, and concerning of sparing a nation because of intercessors. And God will spare a nation because of intercessors. And if you read in Jeremiah 5:1, it says, run ye to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, and see now, and know, and seek in the broad places thereof, if you find a man, if there be any that execute judgment, that seek the truth, I will pardon it. See? And also in Ezekiel 22 verse 30, it says, and I sought for a man among them that should make up the edge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found none. See, no intercessors. If you don't have any intercessors praying for a nation, that nation is bound to be destroyed by God because of immorality, sexual immorality that is going on, tremendous of things that have been happening in Sodom, wickedness, pride, all these things that are happening according to Ezekiel. And these people never turned to God. They never gave no capacity, no concernment to the things of God. And God is going to judge this nation. In verse 27, and he says, and Abraham said again, behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which I am but dust and ashes. And Abraham called himself that he's just but dust and ashes, And that's what man is made of. Man is made of dust and ashes. God says man is found in man. He made man in the ground. And that's what man is. This physical man is dust and ashes. And in verse 28, he says, peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for the lack of 5? And he said, if I find there 45, I will not destroy it. He says, Abraham says, how about 45? If there's a 45 righteous person, are you going to destroy it? God says, I will not destroy it. Verse 29, and he spake unto him yet again and said, peradventure there shall be 40 found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 40's sake. Abraham said, how about 40? God says, I will not destroy it for 40's sake. You see, there is no 40 in Sodom. There's no 40. There's no 40 righteous in Sodom. And now Abraham, bless his soul, he's going to continue with God. It says in verse 30, and he said unto him, O Lord, let not be angry with me, and I will speak. Peradventure there shall be 30 be found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30. He said, how about 30 righteous? God says, I will not destroy if there's 30. See, he's counting down. But there is no 30. There's no 30 righteous in Sodom. And then he says in verse 31, he says, and he said, behold now, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord. Peradventure there shall be 20 found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 20's sake. God says, I will not destroy it for 20's sake. I will not destroy Sodom because of 20 people there. 20 righteous. And there's no 20 righteous here. But again, in 31, it says, and he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry. I will speak yet, but this once. Peradventure 10 shall be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. Abraham said to God, God, don't be angry with me. How about 10? What if there's a 10 in Sodom? God said he will not destroy it for 10's sake. Now, Abraham stopped negotiating now because he didn't bother, because now he know that the men here are corrupt. The entire city of Sodom are corrupt, and God is right to judge it, because even including Lot, here you see a beautiful city, Sodom and Gomorrah, a well-watered place, but it's filled with sin and wickedness. And God is going to judge this city, and he's rightfully going to judge it, because there is nobody there. All of them are corrupt. There's no righteous there that is, interceding in the city. And God is going to judge it here. And then in verse 33, and the Lord went his way as soon as he left, communing with Abraham. And Abraham returned into his place. And Abraham returned. He said Abraham now returns into his place. And now Abraham is very sad. And here Lot's family are fully corrupt, because not even 10 righteous are in Sodom. And here they are in the danger of being annihilated. But Abraham is going to be interceding with for his nephew Lot. And God is now going to destroy this city here. So we're going to continue on verse 19, and when God visits Sodom. But we're going to continue on, but until then, precious saints, God bless you, and we'll talk again.